I'd like to welcome everyone today to the final panel. My name is Almond. I'm going to introduce very quickly to you our two distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Mufti Mudasir, who's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Kashmir, fluent in Urdu, Arabic, Persian, and Kashmiri, and also one of the Penguin Classics translators for Ghani Kashmiri. And then we will also be hearing from Professor Bachamiya Abdul Hussainmiya, who's currently a visiting professor at the Southeastern University of Sri Lanka and taught for 28 years in the history department of the University of Brunei Darussalam. And he asked me to say something extra, but I will leave it to him to articulate it fully. So we will begin with Dr. Mufti.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to thank Professor Almond and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to make my presentation here. My paper is titled The Politics of the Indian Style, the Use of Literary Persian During the Mughal Decline. And I would straightway go to my paper because I don't think I have much time, 20 minutes. I will try to condense it and say as much as I can. I'm talking about a particular style in Persian poetry, which is sometimes called Sabk-e Hindi. Sabk means style, and Hindi, of course, is Indian. The term Sabk-e Hindi, or the Indian style, designates a style in Persian poetry that thrived roughly from the middle of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century in the Persian-speaking world. Since this period witnessed the growth, consolidation, and decline of the two great Muslim empires, the Mughals in the Indian subcontinent and the Safavids in Iran, the style has come to be seen as a defining feature of Mughal Safavid literature. My aim is to point to and criticize the dominant narrative in scholarship which characterizes this style as a peculiarly Indian style. To make this clear, I will critically analyze the views of some prominent scholars, literary critics and historians, who hold that the term Sabk-e Hindi is perfectly justified because it captures the essential element of Indianness in the literature of the period. The premise on which they base their argument is sometimes explicitly articulated as Indianization of the Persian, which refers to the supposed influence of the peculiar Indian religio-cultural ethos on the Persian poetry of the period. Contrary to this view, I argue that the so-called Indian style poetry bears no distinctive marks of Indianness. The politics of Sabk-e Hindi, therefore, lies precisely in the appropriation of the poetry of the period into a nationalistic paradigm which relies on the notion of Mughal India as a socio-religious entity defined by religious tolerance, pluralism, and multiculturalism, and counterpoises it to the rest of the Islamic world, which is presumed to have been characterized as more or less a monolithic cultural reality. The so-called Indianization of Persian thesis should therefore be seen as an attempt to provide an ideological basis to the idea of India as a great melting point of cultural synthesis. I argue that the idea is presumed rather than proved. I will analyze the views of some of the most notable scholars, very briefly of course, who have propounded this idea and point out the flaws in their argument. I would then proceed to offer a perspective already suggested by some scholars on the so-called Indian style, which is best captured by the term taza goi, or speaking afresh, used by the practitioners of this style themselves, which meant saying something new or in a fresh way. Finally, I will refer to some of the debates around the use of Persian in India in the 18th and 19th centuries to argue that the nationalistic paradigm in which the question of Indian style has been forcibly fitted fails to explain why the participants in those debates never mentioned, let alone defended, any Indianness, and why the disagreements over the language transcended the division on nationalistic lines. I begin with one of the most oft-cited essay by the distinguished Urdu critic of India, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. The name of that essay, title of that essay is Stranger in the City, Poetics of Sabk-e Hindi, which begins with a verse of Asadullah Khan Ghalib, Biya Warid, agar inja abuwat zaban dani, garib shahar nukta-e guftani darad. If there is a knower of tongues here, fetch him. There is a stranger in the city, and he has many things to say. The verse provides a telling opening to the essay, which, despite some of its valuable insights and remarkable stylistic analysis of verses, takes for granted the idea of Indianization of Persian. Farooqi, after naming a few Indian poets such as Faizi, Bedil, Khan-e-Arzu, and Azad Bilgarami, who knew Sanskrit, notes, and I quote, instances of such cross-lingual fertilization between two languages over the centuries should be hard to find in other pre-modern traditions in Asia, end quote. Farooqi also asserts that the poetics of Sabk-e Hindi reveals an unmistakable distance from the classical Arabic-Persian theories of meaning, where ambiguity or polyvalence is not considered a literary virtue. Since all Arabic literary theory has its roots in the Quranic exegesis, whose primary aim is to arrive at the authorial intention, literary criticism in the Islamic world was heavily influenced by this orientation. As against this, Farooqi finds the poets of Sabk-e Hindi consciously exploiting the inherent ambiguities of language to create polyvalent poetic texts. Contrary to the Arabic-Persian tradition, in which deliberate ambiguity or plurivalence is absent, poets of Sabk-e Hindi, and I quote, revel and delight in making poems do more than or different from what one expects them to do, end quote. And then, of course, he cites some poets, Amir Khusro, for example. For Farooqi, Sabk-e Hindi culminates in Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil's poetry, which clearly bears the influence of sophistic or even general non-Islamic mystical dimension. Bedil's valorization of silence is seen by Farooqi as the culminating point in the Sabk-e Hindi poets' attempt to push language to its limits. And as in the words of Farooqi, I quote, language often lets the poet down, unquote. Again, any student of classical Persian can come up with numerous examples of the idea of limitation of language in explaining subtle, especially mystical thoughts. For example, Rumi's famous Persian verse, Ey Khuda binuma tu jan ra muqam kan daram bi haraf mi ruyad kalam. O Lord, show my soul the station where speech flows without words. Farooqi does not try to conceal his politics, as is evident in his criticism of Shibli Nomani, the great Indian literary historian who wrote a 5-volume work on Persian poetry called Sherul Ajam. Although Shibli does show admiration for some poets associated with the school, his overall estimation of Sabk-e Hindi is not high. Farooqi sees this as an unwarranted betrayal by an Indian, hence his jibe at Shibli, given such friends, I quote, given such friends, one doesn't need enemies, unquote. In the last section of his essay, he bemoans the demise of Indo-Persian culture and describes it as a political cultural power and an integrating force. Now, this was just one example of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, but not only literary critics, historians, and most notable of them is Muzaffar Alam, who in many of his books and his essays comes up with this idea of what he very clearly calls the Indianization of Persian. And this is a quote from Muzaffar Alam, who says that these developments show the expanding territory of Persian and also imply its gradual Indianization, which according to some meant the dilution of the purity of the earlier Persian speech, unquote. There is another very intriguing and interesting quote by Muzaffar Alam, which is like this: New Persian symbolized the vanquished Ajam's endeavor to conquer the Arab conquerors culturally. For Alam, Persian poetry had already integrated many themes and ideas from pre-Islamic Persia and had been an important vehicle of liberalism in the medieval Muslim world. The same, he thinks, was repeated in the Indian context. Persian poetry helped in no insignificant way in creating and supporting the Mughal attempt to accommodate diverse religious traditions. The unusual complexity of much of Indian style has led to another speculation which plainly states that the success of Mughal Empire in India depended upon how it forged a new Indian identity from diverse philosophies, and since poetry was a powerful means to do so, The poets of this persuasion put their ideas in indirect and complex language. Akbar's court poets Urfi and Fazi are especially credited with secularism and free thinking in defiance of the orthodox and reactionary ideas and values which were followed by the earlier poets. And indeed, such a hazardous task could only be carried out cautiously under the cover of metaphorical language capable of being interpreted in more than one way. The much favored device of iham, or double entendre, where a word simultaneously means more than one thing, is therefore interpreted as an indirect way of challenging religious orthodoxy, something which is very often described as a characteristic mark of Sabk-e Hindi poetry. Now, this is such a persistent thing in scholarship that critic after critic and scholar after scholar is repeating the same. Rajiv Kinra, although making some significant departures from this narrative, still uses this phrase, provocative and antinomian poetry of the Mughal period. And his thesis is that one of the reasons that there was a mass migration from Safavid Iran to Mughal India was that in Iran, the poets did not have the freedom to express what he calls provocative and antinomian themes in poetry. And they found the same, this kind of atmosphere or environment in Mughal India. Now, having stated this thesis, now I go on to say something about it. As is already known that this term, Sabk-e Hindi, was actually coined by Iranian critics to designate what they felt was a decadent style in Persian poetry, and for which they held Indian poets responsible. And this is now very well known, but I want to just go to this passage. The consolidation of British rule in India meant the dethroning of Persian as the language of power, prestige, and literary culture. Although in their early years, it must be noted, the British promoted rather than discouraged Persian learning, as can be seen in the establishment of the Madrasa or Mohammedan College in 1781. But the new educational policy adopted by the British meant a reversal of the earlier attitude to Persian. The pronouncement of Lord William Bentinck in the resolution of March 1835, already stated by Thomas Macaulay before, was that in future the motive of the company should be the promotion of European literature and science through English language. So, historians and critics who differed with the British colonial and Indian nationalist historiography on the character and function of Persian in its heyday in India tried to construct a different narrative, one that posited a seminal role for the Persian language in the Indian context, which was culturally distinct from the rest of the Islamic world because of the convergence of diverse religious, philosophical, and cultural currents. Now, a very important figure for the propounders of this theory of Sabk-e Hindi is Amir Khusro. Now, Amir Khusro is credited with founding Hindui, which is a source of both Hindi and Urdu. He's considered to be the chief architect of Indo-Persian tradition. His mastery over a number of languages like Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Turkish, which enabled him to contribute richly to this tradition, is also seen as a mark of India as a unique place of amalgamation of diverse linguistic and religious traditions. Now, Khusro famously called himself Tot-e-Hind, and in one of his verses he says, "I'm a Turk of Hindustan. I answer in Hindui. I don't have Egyptian sugar to speak Arabic." In section 3 of Nuh Sipher, which is the title of one of his works, Khusro presents an imaginative and largely fanciful image of India as a land akin to paradise. He even appeals to some Islamic narratives to create a portrait of India as a land gifted by God in many ways. A reason for India's greatness, says Khusro, is that he lives in it. One of the fascinating and greatly admirable things about Indian culture, according to Khusro, is the practice of sati, which shows the devotion of a wife to her husband, a devotion that can only be found in India and nowhere else. And Now, the narrative in question, of course, does not mention Amir Khusro's works such as Miftahul Futuh, which is the first war epic or Razmiya written in Muslim India celebrating the victories of Jalaluddin Khilji, or Khazainul Futuh, with its glorification of the triumph of the Turk against the Hindu, not to talk of discerning the glorification of the Muslim power in his love epic Ashika, which relates the romantic love story of Alauddin Khilji's son Khizar Khan for the Hindu princess of Gujarat, Deval Rani. Now, a paragraph about the problems in the conceptual category of Sabk-e Hindi, which presents challenges which have mostly been glossed over by its advocates as well as its detractors. Both of him try to link it to the Indian context. It is known that the poets most often considered as its practitioners never use the term. Instead, they call their poetry taza goi or ravish taza. Secondly, these poets already had established reputations before they migrated to India. Nahavandi, the chronicler at the court of the famous Mughal noble Abdurrahim Khan Khanan, in his Ma'asir-e-Rahimi, tells us that Urfi had already won accolades for his taza goi before coming to India. Naziri Nishapuri, Urfi Shirazi, Talib-e Amuli, Kalim Kashani, and Sahib Tabrizi, and the Indian Fazi, all of whom are considered to be the best representatives of the Indian style, betray no self-consciousness of this supposed Indianness of their poetry. What they are exceedingly conscious of, however, is their newness or taza goi, and some of them lay claim, quite acceptable in Persian poetic tradition, of ta'alli or tafakhur, to being pioneers of this newness. Now, there are quotes, for example, Talib saying that he is the pioneer of this new style, or Saib saying that talkh kar di zindagi bar ashnayane sukhan, in qadar Saib talashe manae begana chist. Saib says, you have made life difficult for those who know poetry. Saib, why such intense search for unfamiliar meanings? So, in fact, this desire for speaking afresh can explain well the context in which the new style flourished. Instead of viewing taza goi as a product of a collective, fresh, new worldview, it is more rewarding to see how this newness was propelled by the desire to create new meanings from an already existing repertoire of images and symbols. For example, Fazi says, Tazi tu arasta gardat sukhan, manae no bayado lafze kohan. If poetry be adorned by you, let there be new meanings but old words. And Kashmir's famous Persian poet, Ghani Kashmiri, puts it like, Dar mukarrar bastane mazmoon rangeen lutf neest, kai dahadarang arkasi bandad hinae bastara. A colorful theme applied again gives no pleasure. How can color come from hina if applied twice? So the idea is that we have to look at the genre of ghazal as a kind of poetry. To understand the need felt by the poets for speaking afresh, one has to note that the Persian ghazal is a highly conventional literary form which has exhibited a remarkable degree of structural and thematic continuity over a period of 8 centuries or so. With its fixed meters, well-established images and tropes, and a peculiar form where all verses end with a refrain, it is not surprising that repetitions and imitations of previous texts are a common feature in the ghazal. This highly conventional nature of the ghazal imposes certain restrictions on the practitioner, constraining his freedom of expression to fit the form. I'm skipping the rest, and I now come to the last section, which I will try to sum up in 5 minutes. This section deals with some important literary disputes which took place during the 18th and 19th centuries in the Indian subcontinent between literary scholars, which in my opinion are useful in understanding the dynamics of nationalistic discourses and literary expression. They throw into sharp relief the fallacy of framing the controversies over language into a paradigm which puts them in a binary of the Iranian and the imaginary Indianized Persian. I argue that these controversies reveal an anxiety in the Indian users of Persian to prove themselves to be its competent users. Far from being a division between the Iranians and Indians, these controversies were centered on the questions of correctness and eloquence and divided Indians themselves into 2 groups. Again, there is little to suggest that literary criticism of the period is conscious of any Indianness in either style or content. To be sure, the notion of the so-called Indianness was invoked by some like Hazin, Ali Hazin and Ghalib as a part of a polemics against their opponents. While Hazin clearly exhibited a linguistic chauvinism in censuring all Indian poets, Ghalib was motivated by a desire to prove himself superior to his contemporary Indian peers. Hence his boast here and there that I'm Bood Ghalib Andalibi as Gulistane Ajam Manze Ghaflat Tutiye Hindustan Namidamash. Ghalib was a nightingale from a garden in Persia. I was mistaken to call him a parrot of India. And finally, about these debates, the debates between Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu and Ali Hazin, and the books that were written during this period. In Shah Jahan's time, for example, Munir Lahori wrote Karnama-e Munir, describing the attitude of Iranians towards Indians and deploring the alleged arrogance of the former towards the latter. Lahori also defends the style of earlier poets and criticizes the new style poets for what he termed as their over-improvisation, convoluted style, use of hyperbole, strange metaphors, and ambiguous constructions. In the preface, Lahori writes that he has seen many contemporary poets mocking the style of classical Persian poets. He witnessed an assembly where some new poets boasted of the greatness of Urfi and Talib-e-Amuli and ridiculed the past masters like Raziuddin Nishapuri, Kamal Isfahani, Amir Khusro, Salman Saviji. And he writes, Anra ku chako fakir mi shumardand. They reckon them small and poor. Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu wrote a rebuttal of Munir Lahori's Karnama. The treatise purposefully titled Siraj-e Munir, which simultaneously means the glowing lamp and the lamp torching Munir, aims to refute Lahori's charges against the poets of Tarz-e-Taza or the new style, especially the four reputed ones, Urfi Shirazi, Talib-e-Amuli, Zulali, and Zuhuri Turshizi. Arzu contends that Lahori's misunderstanding or misconstrual stems from his inability to fathom the nuances of metaphorical usage. Arzu was in turn refuted by Varas Sialkoti and Abdul Hakim Lahori. So, and the debate goes on between Indians themselves on the question of what constitutes the correct and the eloquent style of in Persian poetry. And Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu emerges as a very prominent figure in this. And I just want to refer to one book of Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu. I have not really discussed his Sirajul Lughat or some other works that he wrote. Arzu's Musmir discusses the commonalities in Persian and Sanskrit, but this should not be seen as an attempt to postulate a distinctly Indian Persian. Although Arzu observed correspondence between the two languages on phonological, morphological, and semantic levels, he did not, unlike William Jones a few decades later, postulate a single source of these languages. To conclude, and this is the last thing I have to say, to conclude, re-examining the conceptual category of Sabk-e Hindi in the light of the discussion above allows us to see it as a historically produced and bound to a national imaginary narrative. Indeed, there is a need to re-evaluate the Indo-Persian literary tradition from a perspective that is fully aware of the problems inherent in nationalistic historiography, the dominant paradigm so far among the Indian critics after independence. Thank you.
I wish to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present a paper in this conference. Well, I mean, as you see, I am the last man standing. But at the same time, I'm also the odd man in this whole conference. Here we are talking about great intellectual transformation changes involving the Arab, Turkish, Safavid, Mughal period. And here I come from a small island of Sri Lanka, a very notorious island, famous for its internal strife. And here I'm going to come in and say what significance the island of Sri Lanka holds in the whole gamut of this intellectual thought from the 16th and 19th century. After all, Sri Lanka is not an easy place. Our ancestral great father, Adam, set foot in my country. So much so, people like Ibn Battuta came all the way to visit that mountain. And the other foot, of course, we know, was imprinted not far away from here in Jeddah. So that much I can have a claim for Sri Lanka. First thing I had to do is I had to justify my presence here, and I must tell my methodology and what my approach here. As the professor says, I am using an out and historical approach. And within the part of the intellectual history, I'm going to compare what really happened between the Western Islamic scholarship. When I said Western, I'm talking about Turkish, Safavid, Mughals versus the Malay scholarship. So, what is my chance for this? Now, I had to publicize myself a little bit. Why this whole event where I'm fitting into the system? This was the picture taken when I happened to discover more than 200 manuscripts for the first time in Sri Lanka, which consisted of Arabic Tamil, Malay manuscripts, which really became a great hit towards the Malay world is concerned. When this news came up, this picture was taken and sent all over the world because the Malay world, the so-called Malay world, which is in the East, was very excited to find out that they never expected the small island of Sri Lanka to be in this part of the Malay world through the intellectual exchange of traditions. I'll come to that. As we know, these contacts between West and East is not something new. This has been going on for ages. My position is why Sri Lanka has become important because of the reason why Indian Ocean became an important seaway in this. I think already one or two speakers have mentioned the importance of Indian Ocean as a transmitting point between the Islamic intellectual tradition from the Turkish and Safavid areas and also to the Malay area. I have a point to say that what happened in the Malay world, I will come to the point, Malay world was actually what happened not between the Islamic thought and the Malay world in the East. It has been already happening even in the pre-Islamic time during the Hindu period. During the Hindu period, the ideas of kingship, ideas of religion, ideas of justice, ideas of conduct were transmitted by Brahmins to Malayan world where there were Hindu kingdoms at that period. When Islam appeared on the scene, Islam actually followed the same tradition of taking these ideas from the West to the East, just like what the previous Brahmins did. So, my point is that now we are talking about 16th, 17th century. That is during the pre-print culture era, when printing presses came to exist in Cairo, Istanbul, Mumbai, Singapore, Colombo, and other places linked to the study, which produced and duplicated prolific publications, is critically important to trace the nucleus formation of common themes for creating Islamic epics and kitab literature by the Arab-Persians, Indians, and the Malay people. Now, I don't want to go over this thing. As you know, the very important phase of Indian Ocean, which is a meeting point of all the oceans. And the importance of Indian Ocean is at the southernmost tip of India, all the main coastal ports were there, like Calicut on the side, on the Malabar side, and all these places where the Arabs were able to stay to take the next ship using the inter-monsoonal changes. So during this period, we see emergence of a hybrid type of Islamic people emerging who had Arab fathers and the indigenous people like Malabaris and also Tamilians. And their progeny, the Moors, populated Sri Lanka to a great extent. And here you have got another culture, not the West, not the Malay East, but you get a South Asian Islamic culture, which is also very critically important in the transmission of Islamic knowledge and ideas in the 16th, 17th centuries, as I will be coming across. this Indian Ocean became the crossing point of Europeans, Chinese, Arabs, Persians, and Indians seeking varied coastal markets. I have written out all these points very details. My paper, you can get it from the thing. I think I will avoid this because I have to come to contribute to this conference from the point of view of Sri Lanka. This is a part of the things. Again, I was talking about the ports of South India. Here you get all the important ports, Goa, Calicut, Cochin, all these were highly Islamized ports. And on the Coromandel coast, we have got Kayalpattanam, Keelakkarai, Tranquebar, everything Islamized. And you can see Sri Lanka at the bottom of it. By nature itself, the sea lanes have to cross through Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka and not only Sri Lanka, even Maldives became a very important point in this transmission of ideas from west to east. Now, I don't want to talk again too much about Islam in Southeast Asia. Islam in Southeast Asia established somewhere in the 10th century, and the height of the period started from 13th and 14th century. And as a result of Islamization, all the coastal states, we call peninsula states, and archipelagic states like Indonesia, Malaysia, became Islamized. And although Islam was established on the 13th century, 14th century, the real intellectual uprise, or what you call intellectual contributions, began only from the 16th century. Now, this is what next I'm going to find out. What is the significance of the period from 16th to 18th centuries? Now, the long-term intra-oceanic connections that existed since the advent of Islam among the Arab-Persian and the Indian-Ocean Muslim communities thrived further between these 2 centuries. And with the advent of Europeans in West Asian waters, pioneered by the Portuguese in 1498 by circling the Cape of Good Hope, the Muslim kingdoms faced threats, not just in the expansion trade, but also in preserving their religious and intellectual traditions. In other words, the Islamic kingdoms in the East had to go into a self-preservation mode. Already, the great Malacca kingdom in the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, a home of glorious Islam and intellectual virility, fell in the year 1511, that is the early part of 16th century. So the new coastal kingdoms emerged to fill the vacuum of the Malacca Empire in the East. The great Muslim empires of the Ottoman Turks, Safavids of Iran, and Mughals in India thrived during this period. So I'm trying to tie up these two things. Exactly on the period when Islam states were emerging in the East, and that is a time when all these 3 great ruling kingdoms were thriving. Now here we have seen the Islamic Empire, the common, I've poached it from the internet, how the Islamic kingdoms is connected to Southeast Asia. It's a very easy map to understand, and through India and Sri Lanka, these connections have been made. Right. So I've written something on Ottoman Turks, which I don't think I need to repeat here. Then I've written something about Safavids from 1501 to 1736, just to prove the point that how the coexistence of these 3 great empires have contributed to the idea exchanges for this period, just as what happened in the previous period. Then, of course, the Mughal Empire, we know, from 1516 to 1857, Mughal empires too. Also, all these three great kingdoms have something to do with the intellectual virility or intellectual activities in the Southeast Asia. Now, 17th and 18th century. What happened in 17th century, the most critical, important state was Aceh. Aceh was at the tip of the Sumatra. You can see the blue color. The Pasai, Samudra Pasai. That was one of the early states to embrace Islam. And that is a very important nodal point for traders to pass through. And that created a very heavy kingdom. And at that time, already Portuguese and Dutch were active in Southeast Asia. And that is the kingdom produced highest number of the well-known Islamic intellectuals in the Malay world. Next come the Johor kingdom. Johor is in the southern part of the peninsula. What I'm trying to say to you is, By the time 16th, 17th century started, very critically important kingdoms like Pahang, Johor, Aceh had emerged already in Southeast Asia. And these are the kingdoms which nurtured and helped Islam, not only to Islam to thrive, for Islamic intellectual tradition also to take roots. Right. And let me here briefly say, what were the most important names in the Southeast Asian Islam? Now, we know all the great names on the West. As scholars, we understand. Now, I point out this great Hamza Fansuri. Hamza traveled widely and was known to have visited the Malay Peninsula, Mughal India, Mecca, and Medina, and Baghdad. He was one of the first Southeast Asians to complete the Hajj. The date of his death is generally assumed to be around 1590. However, an inscription on a gravestone found in Mecca for Sheikh Hamza bin Abdul Allah al-Fansuri recorded date of 1527. Now, Hamza Fansuri actually is a writer, well-known writer, Sumatran Sufi, and mystical pantheistic in the Malay language. And he is the first to introduce Jawi script or Arabic script to write the Islamic poetry. And his poetry of Sufism is still remain as greatest example of Sufi thinking in the Malay world. The next person will be, this is the Malay world I'm talking, all the green idea. All these are, in fact, part and parcel of this great intellectual changes that is occurring during this period. Now, there is a second person I can quote it. You can see the date, 1615 to 1693. He is Abdul Rauf Singhal. Abdul Rauf got his early education in India before continuing his studies in Makkah with Sheikh Abu Afas Umar bin Abdullah Bashahiban. He also received education in Medina, Jeddah, Mecca, Zavid, and Belafaki for over 19 years. Apart from that, he also received education in Aceh and Palembang. Among his teachers identified were not less than 15 people, including Abdul Qadir Maurir in Makkah, Ahmad al-Quraishi in Medina, and Burhanuddin Maula Ibrahim ibn Hassan al-Qurani. He's authored a very famous Malay work called Miratul Tullab fi Tawsil Marifat al-Akam, Ash-Sharia li Malik al-Wahhab, al-Muhtajeen, and Kifayat al-Muhtajeen, among other works on fiqh and tasawwuf. And mind you, all these works were found in Sri Lanka also. So that is the link. I'm bringing Sri Lanka into this intellectual exchange traditions. Now, other very important person is Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassar. He was in Sri Lanka for 4 years, and he was a great fighter, and he was expelled by the Dutch to Sri Lanka first, and he wrote 4 or 5 kitabs in Sri Lanka. One is a famous Al-Barakat al-Sailaniya, and the rest of the kitabs he wrote in South Africa, because the Dutch feared that Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassar, 1626 to 1699, was a very popular leader and alim and a Sufi. The Indonesians will land in Sri Lanka to capture him and send it back. So the Dutch feared that this will happen, and they re-exiled them to the South Africa, where he died. So according to the Malay belief, that his krama or his graves are scattered all over the places, in Sri Lanka, in Banten, and also in South Africa. Why I am mentioning all these names, sir? From the dates you can see, these were some of the great names who have produced many kitabs in terms of Islamic traditions. Now, the religious and epics literature, how many minutes, sir? How long I have? Oh, yes. Well, I think I'll better come back to when I talked about Sri Lanka too much, a little bit of it. I'm just leaving you to understand, and you can read my paper, how the Islamic literature in this part of the world derived mostly from the examples. They got it from great intellectual scholars who were living in Makkah. And all these people learned mostly Arabic and the literature at Makkah and Hijaz. So that's how these people ended up here. Let me go fast back to Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka as a focal point. You can see how a tiny Sri Lanka in the dot in the world map. Sri Lanka. Here, there was a well-established Arab Moor society emerged. Even today, Sri Lanka has 8% of the Islamic people. They are mostly Tamil speakers. They are the descendants of Arab fathers and the Tamil and Malayalis. So they are known as Moors. Now, arrival of the Portuguese arrested the spread of Islam island-wide. According to Tennant, if not for the Portuguese, Islam would have become the sole national religion of Sri Lanka. The British writer who he thought that just like Maldives, like Malaysia, Sri Lanka would have been 100% Islamized if not for the intervention of the Portuguese in 1505. And to this country, a new group of people joined, that is from Malaya and Indonesia. And I belong to one of those groups. These Malay people came largely as exiles, political exiles. Indonesian princes, kings was exiled to Sri Lanka, and they were followed with quite a lot of workers, particularly working in the Dutch and British army. And they were mainly military people like Gurkhas of India. And those people brought along with them important kitabs belonging to the Indonesian royal families. Right. Yes. 1974 discovery of significant amount of manuscripts, lithographed and printed material in JavaScript. You know what Java is? Arabic script adapted to write Malay is JavaScript, that date back to 17th and 18th centuries. Replica of Islamic learning that prevailed in the Nusantara. Nusantara means the Indonesia and Malaysia put together, as seen from many kitab, Tasawwuf and fiqh written by Sheikh Yusuf Makasa, Sheikh Raful Sinkal, Sheikh Shamsuddin al-Pasai, and Sheikh Nuruddin al-Raniri and others were found in Sri Lanka. Significance of Tufa Sarandip, a catechistic text. Now, I happened to discover another important text in Chennai, which is called Tufa Sarandip, which is talking about the Wahdatul Wujudiya or Ibn al-Arabi's concept. When the concept of monism was thriving, Sri Lanka became the center for studies. And in Sri Lanka was a home and haven of Sufism, under whose feet the Indonesian princes studied. So when the Indonesian exiles came to Sri Lanka and worked with the Sufi people who are mostly from the West, either it could be Iranian Sufis or it could be Baghdadi Sufis, there were two important people mentioned in history. One is Ibrahim, one is Idris. So in other words, the Idrisiya and Shatariya orders were in Sri Lanka in the 17th century, where the Indonesian kings and princes and their progeny sat at their feet in Sri Lanka and studied Islam thoroughly. And mind you, when they went back to Indonesia, when they took power, Indonesia like Yogyakarta, it was those people who studied in Sri Lanka, Islam, they became the ministers in Indonesia. So that way, Sri Lanka was quite significant. Now, this is what I'm talking about it. The people, Malay people were regiment people. Now, nobody knew that the regiment people who were working for the British as their soldiers had any kind of education or even any kind of intellectual activity. But suddenly, as I said, in 1974, when I discovered, the whole theory was proven not right, because they were not only brawny soldiers, but they were brainy people. Just as much as they were fighting for the British, they were also kept up a very strong traditions of Islamic learning in Sri Lanka, derived from all the great Islamic intellectual leaders I just mentioned. All their works were also studied thoroughly in Sri Lanka. And this is one of the alim, of course, it's a very late period, very famous man. He's the first man to publish a newspaper in Sri Lanka, in Malay. First, the whole Malay world, in Sri Lanka this man published. You can see from the address, although he belongs to the 19th century, this tradition would have continued before. And this is how one of our typical alim of the period would have looked like. Now, these are some of the manuscripts I discovered in Sri Lanka. Quite a number of them, 200 of them. And some are still not worked out. We need to study them. And at the moment, I'm working on 2 manuscripts. Right, finished. So here I'm trying to tell you the relationship between Tamil and Arabic, both are written in the same script. The reason why Islamic intellectual tradition thrived in Sri Lanka was because they were using a common script, like Sindhis. Urdu, of course, little advanced, but in Sri Lanka, they used to write both Arabic and Tamil in the same kind of script. I'm just showing some of the Sri Lankan Malays, their current traditional Malays, and I want to show something of the Moors. So those are Sri Lankan Moors. Of course, those caps they wore late period during the time of the Fez institution, with then Sultan Abdul Hamid period. They emulated them. The Turkey was having a strong influence in the 19th century. These are the contemporary Sri Lankan Malay people, right? Yeah, concluding question. I must tell you some of these things. I have a theory I need to work out. See, the Western Arabic Islamic scholarship is somewhat deeper origin. And they spread around very deep meaning. But as far as the Malay Islamic scholarship, has only 2 aspects as far as my learning is going on. One is about the fiqh. The other one is mostly tasawwuf. For some reason, the tasawwuf has attracted quite a lot. And if you see the Malay kitabs, most of them are either adapted, derived, or reworked Sufi work. So this is very good aspect of it. I need to work out on this. Anyway, this conference has opened up my own thoughts, because in my studies, I've done my PhD on this area, I never thought in terms of the 16th, 17th century. I only discovered this manuscript I started describing as such. But from this conference, now I have to think about what really happened in the 16th, 17th century. Why did the Western scholarship or Islamic scholarship could have thrived to a great extent than in the Malay world? Partly because the Malay world did not have a very strong tradition of madhabs and also the madrasas. They started quite late. So what they needed was some basic ideas about how to bathe the corpse, how to take wudu, that kind of thing. So even in the 17th century, that is what becoming very popular and famous. So in a society where they are trying to Islamize in a practical way, I don't think there will be deeper intellectual kind of questioning happening. Even so, the people who involved in that, they were attracted, the so-called Sufi tradition. So this is the thing I'm trying to work out. And thanks for this great opportunity. When I go back, I'll work on this thing and think not only about Sri Lanka, about what happened in the Southeast Asian Islam. Okay. So this has to be worked out.
I also want to thank you for this great opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I know we're pressed for time, but we're going to allow just for some questions. I think it's Rifat, is it? Please.
I wish I could, basically I should try to ask a question of both of you, because I don't have first-hand experience or knowledge of the kind of scholarship you do. So the question that actually persists from other presentations today is the question of culture. And no one has actually addressed the phenomenon you're dealing with. You dealt with it as religion, Islam, rather than what people under the same umbrella invented together is a common culture. And you basically pointed out there's a propensity. There was no force in conversion. There were no missionaries in that sense, the way that Christianity actually produced missionaries, and in a way forced it on non-Christians, whether in Africa or even in Europe. So the question becomes, there seems to be some kind of sympathetic receptivity to Islam that actually finds a home. Now, it's not forced. Nobody is imposing it. It seems to be a choice. And basically, that's your question. What's the explanation? And I turn the question to the two of you and see if you can actually bring us your own estimates of an answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to collect another question, Sajad. And then I might collect a third question, and then, because we are under time pressures.
I have a question for Mufti Saab. In terms of how Sabk-e Hindi is constructed as a polemic, both internal and also external, I'm interested in how it relates to other languages as well. So, for example, do you find the same polemic about an Indian style of Arabic writing? Because, of course, there's a lot of Arabic poetry and prose being produced, both in India and, the wider kind of notion of Hind. And especially with some of the poetry produced by someone like Azad Bilgrami and others, do you find a similar kind of polemic about a Arabic Sabk-e Hindi? And then that maybe tells us something about the way in which identity is being contested with respect to language in this period.
Okay, and then maybe a third question before I turn to our panelists. Is there a third question? Gentleman over there.
Quick question about, you mentioned about the Sarandi.
Could you speak up again and say the question again, please?
Yeah, sorry. As I have a quick question on the Tuhfa Sarandi that Hussainmiya was mentioning. I would like to know more about, what it, not only its contents, you mentioned that it discusses Wahdat al-Wujud, but how did it end up in Chennai and, and its language and when was it written and things like that?
Okay, well, so just those three questions.
Yeah. Which I find. You are right, sir. Islam in Southeast Asia, this is one thing we learned, that never spread by sword or force. There were a lot of reasons why people had to, they surrendered themselves peacefully to Islamic. According to my understanding, the trade accompanied with great Sufi leaders who come with them were treated almost like a Puritan type of people. And the Malay people were generally, we call it more than others, very much propensity for magic. And they treated or they considered some of these sheikhs who arrived there with a pure white jubba and with their great conduct, the prayers, etc., as great leaders, unlike locals. So what really happened was the local rulers who gave their daughters in marriage to this Puritan sheikh. And their progeny naturally were able to set an example for other rulers to follow. So that's how, in the littoral states, what I mean is wherever the traders went, you see all the areas were Islamized. Whereas in the central states like Thailand, Vietnam, Burma, Islam could not penetrate because they were deep into the interior territory. Whereas Malaysia had all the, like South India, had all the littoral states. Even in Indonesia, we call Pasisir, coastal states. So all these states, we had a small kingdoms. And all these kingdoms, one after the other, embraced Islam for one of the reasons I'm telling you. People may contest this. So that is how Islam could peacefully spread through the medium of trade and example. So it's a totally voluntary affair. In South India, one of the reasons with some of today the Hindutva's people were telling, the Jew people went and converted all the low caste people. The low caste had no way of social mobility. if they don't follow Islam. In Hinduism, there will be always low caste. And it was very easy for all of them en masse to come and embrace Islam. That's one of the theory. But having said that, the Arabian traders could dispense for the local women, their wealth, part of the wealth, and they can patronize the local village leaders, rulers, and through that form, quite a large number of them became Islamized. That is South India. But in the case of Malayan Peninsula and Indonesia, certainly all the rulers were there. I have got a manuscript which says how a sheikh, that is from South India, went all the way to Indonesia and could Islamize. The whole story is being told. That is one of the manuscripts I'm working at it. Yes.
But we need to let them, sorry.
I would just try answer your question with reference to my own place, that is Kashmir. Kashmir was predominantly a Hindu region up to 15th or even 16th century. Islam came to Kashmir first in around 14th century, and then first a few Sufis came who spread the message of Islam. Then a king who was a Buddhist, Rinchen Shah, he converted to Islam in 14th century, somewhere in the middle of 14th century. He was the first Muslim king of Kashmir. And thereafter, it opened the door for what they call the influx of Sufis and other people from Central Asia and Persia. But there is one important factor in conversion of Kashmir to Islam, that is the role of rishis. Now, rishis they were a group of, you could call them Hindu or Buddhist, those ascetics who devoted themselves to the worship of God. They did not marry, they did not eat meat, and they were, they led solitary lives. And these had a tremendous influence on the Islamization of Kashmir. These people who, now modern day historians, when they look back, they try to see how they can place the contribution of these rishis to the Islamization of Kashmir. And one of the very interesting theories is that these rishis actually continue to live the kind of lives they used to live before the coming of Islam. I mean, they were people who were devoted to social service. They were self-abnegating people who did things for the sake of, not for this world, but for something else, a higher spiritual reality. But once Islam came to Kashmir, they became Muslims, but they, in some sense, also retained some elements of their earlier devotion and earlier practices. And it is not up to the 18th century that we find, in 18th century, Rishism actually, disappears, or you can say it gets assimilated into other Sufistic orders. And these people were, of course, known for their, social service and their devotion to God and other such ideas. But as far as this point is concerned, we know that there are narratives, there are stories, of Sufis coming, and one of the things that you find in, in medieval history about conversion is the very popular, you can say, a conflict or a kind of competition between a Hindu saint and a Muslim saint. So there are stories about like this in Kashmir also, that, for example, there is that famous Sufi from Persia, Shah Hamdan, or Sayyid Ali Hamadani, who came to Kashmir in somewhere around 15th century, and he now this is the popular this folklore in Kashmir, that there used to be a Brahmin who was very famous, and who had a large following. And once he challenged Shah Hamdan to a competition, a spiritual kind of way, both will display their spiritual powers. And in that competition, what happened is that this Brahman, he started flying in air. He went up, and then Shah Hamdan did not himself go up into the air. He asked one of his disciples or somebody else to, take out his shoe. And that shoe went up into the air and brought that Brahman down. So these were the stories which were circulated, much later. But I think the transition of Kashmir to Islam over a period of 300 years was largely because of the influence of Sufis as well as rishis who came from Central Asia and Persia. As to Sajad's question, firstly, I don't think that the corpus of Arabic literature in India can be compared to Persian. I mean, if you look at the work that has been done on Arabic poetry, and if you try to identify the main figures of Arabic poetry in India, there are not many. But more importantly, I think because of the Persian being the language of the Mughal culture, Mughal court, and of course the language of the large Islamic world from Iran, Central Asia, down to India. I think because Persian has attracted such scholarship, and because these people that I'm talked about, especially historians like Muzaffar Alam, who try to argue that yes, in languages of political Islam, that when Persian came to India, it had to adapt itself to the Indian context, and it in a way provided that that it was the vehicle through which not only a new kind of Indianness was generated, but it also helped gel the Mughal Empire together. But I have really not come across such a thing as far as Arabic poetry is concerned. Maybe because there are not many Arabic poets. Azad Bilgrami wrote in Arabic. Also, he wrote Arabic poetry. But I think some work really needs to be done in that area to see whether you can find some elements in Arabic also.
Well, the guy, did you have your question answered?
Kuri, yes.
The gentleman here, did you get your question answered?
No, I'm going to answer it.
Very quickly, very quickly.
I think I already given the answer to you. In the port cities, when the Arabs came with their followers, they needed some kind of spiritual guidance. And it's a symbiotic relationship. They supported the Sufi leaders, and Sufi supported the traders. So in that milieu, the whole system of what you call ratibs. Ratib means the Friday night gatherings were held. According to one story in the Indonesian Chronicle. Pardon? My question was specific to that manuscript. Yeah, that manuscript, as I told you, I am a Malay scholar. Well, my problem is I am not an Arabic scholar. So I need another Arabic scholar to come and work together. It's all 100% Arabic. I got somebody to translate for me the first few pages. It shows that there's an author called Ibrahim Mehkani, I don't know whoever it is. Mehkani was engaged in a discussion with one of his gurus on this catechismic about the nature of the Atma, nature of the spirit. So that's how he told me this is something to do with Wahdatul Wujudiyya. That's all I know for the moment. I need to work more details on it. Thank you.